This is Murder on the Amber Road, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the heart of darkness. First, we would like to greatly thank our listeners from all over the world. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and write a comment where you are from. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The Fly in the Amber. The eggs were overboiled. It was, Hercule Poirot reflected, a melancholy beginning to what had promised to be a day of considerable pleasure. He set down his coffee cup, aligned it precisely with the edge of the saucer, and regarded the offending articles with an expression of resigned sorrow. The waiter, then a young man with an honest face and the slightly harassed manner of one perpetually in motion, hovered at a respectful distance. The egg, Poirot informed him gravely, must be approached as a diplomat approaches a delicate negotiation. Firmness on the outside, mon ami. Delicacy within. You understand? The waiter nodded with the enthusiasm of someone who understood nothing at all. Poirot rewarded him with a smile of genuine warmth. One could not, after all, hold a man personally accountable for the failures of a kitchen. He turned his attention, with somewhat greater satisfaction, to the view. Gdansk in summer was a city that wore its history like a well-cut coat. The great merchant facades along the Dlugi Targ blazed in tones of red and gold, beneath an afternoon sky of pale Baltic blue. Below the cafe's wrought iron rail, a Thermotlauer moved with a slow, dark gleam, and against the quayside the fishing boats rocked in drowsy rhythm, their ropes creaking at intervals like old men settling in chairs. The smell of salt and pine resin drifted in from the harbour, mingled with something sweeter, amber dust perhaps, and the warm sugar of waffles from a stall somewhere below. Tourists crowded the cobbles drawn by the festival. Across every market table amber jewellery caught the light, pendants and brooches and smooth carved beads, all of them preserving within their golden depths some fragment of a world 40 million years extinguished. A street musician drew his bow across a violin with fluid precision. Two small children chased a pigeon into a doorway and emerged victorious, having accomplished nothing. It felt, Poirot thought, agreeably free. He had come to Gdansk for pleasure, which was in itself a novelty. The festival of the Amber Road drew collectors from across the continent each summer, and Poirot had a particular interest in a mid-19th century brooch reported to have passed through the hands of a Baltic countess whose misfortunes he had once read about in an article of no great distinction. He did not expect to find it. He had found in the course of a long and eventful life that amber dealers shared with all other dealers a pronounced tendency toward optimism in their catalogues. But the afternoon was fine, the coffee was excellent, and Hercule Poirot was at peace with the world. He did not notice the woman immediately. She came to his table without invitation, which was the first thing. She sat down quickly, one with the practiced economy of someone accustomed to moving without drawing attention, and yet she drew his attention immediately, not through any dramatic quality of her appearance, but through the quality of her stillness. It was the stillness of a person deliberately suppressing motion, which is a different thing entirely from repose. She was perhaps 40 or a little past it, elegantly dressed in a manner that suggested the money had always been there, but the ease with it had been learned. Her hair was wind-disordered in a way that her hands had not troubled to remedy. Her eyes, dark, with a slight downward cast at their outer edges, moved in a pattern he recognized at once. The harbour, the cafe door, the street to the left. Harbour door, street. The circuit of a person who expects to be followed. She knew him. Well, that much was plain before she spoke. "Monsieur Poirot," she said. Her voice was low and carried no particular accent. The voice of a woman educated in several countries and rooted firmly in none of them. Poirot inclined his head. "I have," he said pleasantly, "something of that reputation." She placed something on the table between them, which she had been holding cupped in her left hand. He looked at it. It was a bead of amber, oval, polished to a high gloss, the colour of dark honey. He would have admired it on any other occasion, but the amber was remarkable not for its quality but for its contents. Suspended at the precise centre of the bead in a posture of arrested flight was an insect, a small black fly. Its wings, spread to their full extent, were quite perfect. He studied it for a moment without touching it. "An ancient thing," he said. "Many millions of years old, one would suppose." "Yes." She set it down and removed her hand. Her fingers, he noticed, were not quite steady. "But that is not why I am showing it to you." He raised his eyes to her face. "The road has started again," she said. It was not precisely a sentence that explained itself, and yet something in her manner, the contained urgency, the circuit of the eyes, caused a small, precise movement in his thoughts, as of a key turning in a well-oiled lock. He opened his mouth to inquire further, but she was already standing. "Wait, if you please, madame." She was gone. Not hastily. There was nothing dramatic in her departure. She simply moved into the crowd below the cafe steps and was absorbed by it with the ease of a raindrop returning to the sea. Poirot sat for a moment without moving. He looked at the amber bead on the table. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the waiter, who had witnessed nothing. At the man 2 tables distant, who was reading a newspaper with an absorption that was, on reflection, somewhat too complete. At the balcony above the opposite building, where a couple he had registered at some earlier, unexamined moment stood in low-voiced and apparently heated conference, the woman gesturing repeatedly toward the harbour. Then he looked again at the fly in the amber. 40 million years of perfect preservation. He drew out a small handkerchief of white linen, monogrammed, immaculate, and wrapped the bead with care. He placed it in the breast pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. The coffee had gone cold. He did not finish it. For the remainder of that afternoon, Poirot moved through the festival with the appearance of a man entirely absorbed in the pleasures of an amber market. He examined brooches. He inquired about provenance. He offered opinions on inclusions and clarity that were received by the stall-holders with the respectful attention due to someone who manifestly knew what he was talking about. He also observed with that quality of unobtrusive attentiveness that had confounded criminals across 3 continents, a number of small and individually unremarkable details. The waiter from the cafe, Yannick, his name badge read, passed the market on his way somewhere with rather more speed than a young man on a casual errand generally employs. He paused once at the harbour rail, looked towards the water, and moved on. The man with the newspaper had, or at some point, exchanged it for a different newspaper. He was now reading this second paper with the same unflagging diligence. He had not turned a page in 40 minutes. The arguing couple from the balcony had descended to street level. The woman's face was blotched and miserable. The man kept one hand pressed against his jacket pocket in the manner of a person reassuring himself that something is still there. At the corner of the market, a girl of perhaps 12 sat on an upturned crate, selling bundles of field daisies wrapped in damp newspaper. She had watched Poirot with a particular steadiness since he had first entered the market. When he met her gaze directly, she looked at her flowers with a speed that was itself a form of acknowledgement. And at the far end of the quay, the harbour master, a large man in uniform, was with the bearing of someone to whom authority was so familiar as to have become invisible, spoke into a radio with an expression that suggested the conversation was neither routine nor welcome. None of these things were connected, almost certainly. Poirot touched the breast pocket of his jacket where the amber bead rested in its linen wrapping. He had not visited Gdansk before. He had come, in his own considered view, for a brooch. He was a man who had retired, at least 4 times by various reckonings. He was here for pleasure. The web, however, had a different opinion. He could feel it already. The faint, distinctive tension of separate threads that have not yet revealed their pattern but are, undeniably, attached to the same centre. He went back to his hotel to dress for dinner. The amber bead he placed on the bedside table and where the lamplight fell across it. The fly regarded the ceiling with the patient composure of something that had waited 40 million years already and saw no reason to hurry now. Chapter 2. The Calm. Before he slept badly, which was unusual, and blamed the eggs. It was not, in truth, the eggs. Poirot lay in the clean white darkness of his hotel room and listened to the harbour sounds that drifted through the closed window. The low groan of a vessel's hull against its moorings, the irregular complaint of a gull, and permitted his mind to move, without forcing it, across the objects arranged upon the surface of the day. The woman, the bead. The road has started again. She had known his name. That was not, in itself, remarkable. His name had been known to a great many people for a great many years, and Gdansk was not the far side of the moon, but the manner of the knowing had been particular, not the slight widening of the eyes that attended recognition in a person who had merely read about him, not the cautious, assessing look of someone who had sought him out with a purpose. She had sat down as one sits beside a person one has expected to find in precisely that chair, as though his presence at that café at that hour were a fact she had arranged her morning around, which raised, of course, the immediate and interesting question of how she had known he would be there at all. He had told no one his plans for the afternoon. His itinerary existed only in the small leather notebook he kept in his inside pocket. And Poirot's inside pockets had not, in 40 years of professional life, been successfully searched. He turned onto his other side and regarded the amber bead on the bedside table. The lamp had been extinguished, but a thin bar of harbour light slipped through the gap in the curtains and fell across it at an angle that rendered the fly invisible. The bead was simply a bead, smooth, golden, impenetrable. He closed his eyes. In the morning, he decided, he would begin to ask questions. Not dramatic questions, those could wait. Small, domestic, unalarming ones. The kind that people answer without understanding they have answered anything at all. Breakfast at the Hotel Zlota Kotwica was taken in a long, low-ceilinged room that overlooked a courtyard of lime trees. The tables were well separated, the linen was starched, and the eggs, prepared this time to Poirot's precise specification, communicated the previous evening to a head waiter of admirable gravity, were correct in every particular. He ate with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who has settled a small but important dispute with the universe. 3 of his 5 figures from the previous afternoon were also at breakfast. The man with the newspaper occupied a corner table reading what appeared to be a local broadsheet, with the focused attention of someone who has learned since yesterday to make his interest look genuine. He was perhaps 55. Well-cut grey suit, a little too warm for the season. The hands that held the paper were a scholar's hands. Ink stained at the second finger of the right, the knuckle joints slightly enlarged. He had ordered coffee and nothing else, and the coffee had been sitting untouched for 12 minutes. The woman from the quarrelling couple sat alone near the courtyard windows. Katerina, he did not yet know her name, but the designation formed itself in his mind with the quiet certainty of a label applied to a specimen. She was younger than he had estimated from the balcony, mid-30s perhaps. Her face had the particular exhaustion of someone who has cried recently and then applied composure over the top of it, as one might apply whitewash to a cracked wall. She was eating nothing. She held a cup of tea with both hands as though it were a small, warm animal she had rescued. And at the table nearest the door, finishing his shift or beginning it was difficult to determine which, sat Yannick, the waiter from the Harbour Café. He was out of uniform, which was the first surprise. Dark jacket, open collar. He ate rapidly, but without enjoyment, and his gaze moved to the entrance each time the door opened, with a regularity that had long since passed beyond the habitual into something closer to compulsion. Poirot poured a second cup of coffee, aligned his cup with the edge of its saucer, and considered the room. 3 people connected, in ways not yet fully articulated, to the events of yesterday afternoon. 3 people in the same hotel. This might, of course, be coincidence. The Hotel Zlota Kotwica was the finest establishment within 4 streets of the old town, and the Amber Festival drew persons of means and purpose from across the continent. Coincidence was a real and functioning force in human affairs, and Poirot had learned, at some cost, not to dismiss it entirely. But he had also learned, at rather greater cost, to take note of it. None. He encountered Katerina in the corridor outside the breakfast room in circumstances that he arranged to appear accidental, and which required, in the event, very little arrangement at all. She came around the corner too quickly and checked herself just short of collision. He had, providentially, been standing still. "Forgive me," she said in English that carried the trace of a Central European education. "I did not see you." "On the contrary, madame, the fault is entirely mine." He stepped back and offered a small bow. "I am afraid I was standing in the manner of a man engaged in profound thought, which is an inconsiderate habit in corridors." The faintest possible contraction appeared at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. The reflex of a woman to whom charm is still recognizable even through considerable preoccupation. "You are here for the festival?" she asked, because people do ask such things in corridors, and the question cost her nothing. "I had hoped to find a particular brooch," Poirot said pleasantly. "I find instead that the city has much else to offer." He tilted his head with mild inquiry. "And you, madame? The amber trade, perhaps? Or the history of the route?" Something shifted very slightly behind her eyes. Not alarm, she was too controlled for alarm, but a recalibration, as of someone who has been asked a question they were not expecting to be asked in quite that way. "My sister," she said carefully, "has a small business in amber pieces. I am visiting." Ah, he smiled. How pleasant. I hope she is well. The pause that followed was a fraction longer than the statement warranted. Yes, said Katerina. Quite well, thank you. She excused herself with a courtesy that was, under the circumstances, remarkable, and continued towards the staircase. Poirot watched her go. Her sister, an amber dealer. Someone then embedded in precisely the trade that the woman from the cafe had been discussing. Obliquely, urgently, in the 45 seconds before she vanished. He turned the conjunction over in his mind as he retrieved his hat and cane from the porter's desk and stepped out into the morning. The city smelled of bread and salt water. The festival had resumed its cheerful violence on the cobbles. It was in the market, perhaps an hour later, that he found her again, not Katerina, but the girl with the daisies. She was in the same position as the previous afternoon, on the same upturned crate at the corner of the amber stalls, with the same bundles of field flowers across her knees. She was watching him with the same unself-conscious steadiness she had shown before. And this time, when he approached and crouched to examine the flowers with genuine appreciation, she did not look away. She was 12, perhaps 13, dark-eyed with the angular economy of a child who has grown up in a city rather than a garden. She held out a bunch of daisies without speaking. "How much?" Poirot asked. She told him. He paid without negotiation, which produced a flicker of surprise. "You were here yesterday," he observed, in the mild, interested tone one might use to comment on the weather. "And the day before, I think." A small pause. Then, in accented but careful English, she said, "I am here every day." "Of course." He turned the daisies in his hands. "It is good to have a fixed position. One sees everything from a fixed position." She said nothing, but she did not look at her flowers. "The lady who spoke to me yesterday afternoon," he said, still pleasantly, still examining the daisies. "The one at the cafe. You know her, I think." The stillness that came over the girl's face was not the blankness of ignorance. It was the specific, practiced stillness of someone who has been instructed in exactly what to do when this question is asked. "I don't know anybody," she said. "No," said Poirot gently. "Of course not." He straightened, tucked the daisies under his arm with an air of perfect contentment, and bid her good morning. He walked away at a pace calculated to suggest that the conversation had been of no particular consequence. Behind him, he heard the soft, rapid sound of the girl's feet on the cobbles, moving away in the opposite direction, toward the harbour. He did not turn. He did not need to. He was thinking instead of a word the woman had used. Road. Not route, not path, not journey. Road. A specific word carrying a specific weight. The Amber Road was not merely a trade route. It was an identity, a history, a name that people along its length had been using for centuries with the easy possessiveness of those who consider themselves its rightful inhabitants. She had not said the trade has started again, or the trouble, the road, as though the road itself were the thing, as though it had a will, a momentum, a habit of continuation that required only the right pressure applied to the right point to set it moving once more. He was still turning this over when he returned to the hotel at noon to find a small knot of people gathered in the lobby, speaking in the compressed, urgent undertones that invariably accompany news of a violent and unexpected kind. He paused at the edge of the group. A woman's body had been discovered at the harbour not an hour since, laid at the edge of the dock with her arms folded, and an expression on her face that the harbour master, a man not given to imaginative commentary, had described as peaceful. Poirot asked one question. The description he was given matched, in every particular that mattered, the woman who had sat down at his table the previous afternoon. He went upstairs to his room and sat for a moment on the edge of the bed. The amber bead was where he had left it. The fly inside it, interrupted in its ancient flight, was perfectly still. The road had started again. That much at least was no longer in any doubt. Chapter 3. The message on the chest. The body had been arranged. That was the first and most important fact, and Poirot established it within 30 seconds of being permitted. After a certain amount of quiet persistence directed at a young police sergeant of considerable stubbornness, to approach the dock. The woman lay on her back, her arms folded across her chest with a precision that nature does not produce. Her coat was buttoned to the collar. Her shoes were still on her feet. Her hair, which had been wind-disordered the previous afternoon, was now smoothed back from her face with a care that spoke of deliberate attention. Someone had tidied her. This was not, in Poirot's experience, the behaviour of a person who had committed a crime in panic and fled from its consequences. This was something else entirely. The behaviour of a person making a statement. He stood at the edge of the dock and looked at her for a long moment, conscious of the harbour moving around him. The gulls, the creaking ropes, two fishermen watching from the adjacent jetty with expressions of uneasy curiosity. Inspector Nowak of the Gdansk City Police was a square, solid man of perhaps 45, with a grey moustache considerably less distinguished than Poirot's own, and the manner of someone who had seen enough of human foolishness to have formed settled opinions about most of it. This he had not been pleased to find a small, immaculately dressed Belgian civilian already present at his crime scene. He had become, if anything, slightly less pleased when Poirot had introduced himself by name. Poirot, he repeated in the flat tone of a man filing the information under an inconvenient category. The detective. Retired, Poirot said pleasantly. I am here entirely as a tourist. I happened to be acquainted with the deceased. This produced a silence of a quality that Poirot found encouraging. Nowak looked at him with narrowed eyes, then at the body, then back at Poirot. You had better tell me about that, he said, with the greatest pleasure. Poirot paused. But first, you will permit me? There is something beneath the stone. Nowak followed his gaze to the dead woman's chest. A small piece of amber rested there. You were catching the flat grey morning light. A uniformed officer had already photographed it, but no one had yet looked beneath it. At Poirot's indication, Nowak crouched, produced a glove, and lifted the stone. A card, small, white, the kind one might find in any stationer's shop in any city in Europe. On it, in a precise and characterless hand, the road begins. Below the words, a fragment of map, the Amber Road, rendered in clean lines, running south from the Baltic coast through the cities of the ancient route. One city circled, Gdansk. Beside it, the numeral 1. Nowak read it twice, which was, Poirot felt, the appropriate response. And the amber? Poirot asked, if you will permit me to examine it. The stone was passed to him in an evidence bag. He held it to the light. Inside, preserved with the same terrible fidelity as the fly and the bead at his hotel, was an ant. Black, complete, its mandibles fractionally parted. He handed it back without comment. But in his mind, something had shifted very precisely, like the second hand of a watch catching on a new tooth of the escapement. Her name, Nowak told him, was Elena Kovac. She had been registered at the smaller Hotel Amber, 3 streets from the old town, under her own name and with a Budapest address. Her papers were in order. Her occupation was given as dealer in historical amber goods, which the contents of her hotel room confirmed: catalogues, correspondence files, photographs of pieces with handwritten provenance notes attached. She had also apparently been in the middle of something rather more than a commercial visit. "There is a research file," Nowak said with the careful neutrality of a man describing something he does not yet understand. Many pages, historical documents, trade records going back 60, 70 years, records of amber shipments, but also other things. "Other things," Poirot repeated with mild encouragement. Nowak met his eyes. "Passenger manifests, from a period when passengers did not officially travel." The words settled between them like stones dropped into still water. "I should very much like to see that file," Poirot said. "I thought you might." Nowak regarded him for a moment. "You will tell me everything you know about your meeting with her." "Of course, though I'm afraid it amounts to rather less than you might hope." They spoke for 20 minutes in the harbour master's office, to a room that smelled of damp rope and old coffee, and that contained, Poirot noted, a radio whose frequency indicator had been turned to a setting not immediately explained by routine harbour operations. The harbour master himself, a large man named Brandt, who gave the impression of occupying more space than was strictly necessary, hovered at the edge of the conversation with the air of someone who would very much prefer not to be a witness to anything. Poirot told Nowak exactly what had happened at the café the previous afternoon: the woman's appearance, her knowledge of his name, the amber bead, the 4 words. He omitted nothing, including his subsequent observations of the 5 figures. He had found, across many decades, that the selective disclosure of information to investigating officers was a practice that returned compound interest in inconvenience. Nowak listened without interrupting, which raised him slightly in Poirot's estimation. "The bead she gave you," Nowak said when he had finished. "You still have it?" "I do." Poirot produced it from his breast pocket, still wrapped in its linen. "A fly. Elena Kovac carried on her person an ant. I find myself wondering what insect will accompany the next communication." The word "next" produced a brief, charged silence. "You believe there will be a next," Nowak said. It was not entirely a question. "I believe," Poirot said, tapping the card that lay on the desk between them, "that a man who writes the numeral 1 beside a city intends to write other numerals beside other cities. This is not the act of a person who has finished. It is the act of a person who has begun." He found Katerina in the hotel lobby at 11:30, sitting in one of the low chairs near the window, with a stillness that was no longer the composed kind. Her handbag was on her lap. She was staring at something in the middle distance that had no physical existence. Poirot sat down in the adjacent chair without preamble. "Madame," he said quietly, "I am very sorry about your sister." The precision of it reached her in a way that careful approach would not have done. She looked at him directly, and in her eyes there was grief and, beneath the grief, something raw, a fear that had not yet resolved itself into any particular object. "How did you know?" she asked. "You told me this morning that your sister had a small business in amber. The woman found at the harbour was Elena Kovac, an amber dealer from Budapest. The physical description is consistent." He paused. "And you have been sitting in that chair for 2 hours." She absorbed this. Her hands tightened on the bag, then deliberately relaxed. "She wrote to me 6 weeks ago," Katerina said at last. "She said she had found something, records from the old routes, not the amber trade as it is now, but as it was operated during and after the war. She said people had been moved along those routes, hidden in cargo shipments. Some of them were refugees, some of them were not given a choice." She paused. A tram went past the window, its bell sounding once. "Our father was one of them," she said. "He did not survive the journey. Elena spent 15 years establishing that fact and another 5 trying to find out who had been responsible." Poirot was silent for a moment. "Did she find out?" he asked. "She believes so. She told me when she telephoned last week that the men who had operated the network, the ones who were still living, were here, in Gdansk, for the festival." Katerina looked at him steadily. "She said the amber was how they communicated, had always been how they communicated. Amber pieces passed between certain dealers, certain collectors. She said if she could document the pattern, she could expose them. And instead," Poirot said with great gentleness, "someone exposed her." Katerina's jaw tightened. She nodded once. "The man she was afraid of," Poirot said. "Did she give you a name?" "No, she was careful about that. She said—" Katerina stopped. She was looking past him, at something over his shoulder. Poirot turned with the unhurried ease of a man merely shifting his position. The man from the corner table, grey suit, scholar's hands, was crossing the lobby toward the main door. He was carrying a briefcase that he had not had at breakfast. He walked with the slightly too deliberate pace of someone consciously not hurrying. He did not look in their direction, which was, Poirot thought, precisely the wrong thing to do. A man who passes 2 people in conversation will glance toward them, however briefly, unless he already knows the nature of the conversation and has made a decision about it. He watched the man pass through the revolving door and disappear into the brightness of the street. "Tell me," he said, turning back to Katerina. "In your sister's letters, did she mention a historian, a man who specialized in Baltic amber routes? Something in the academic line?" Katerina frowned. The question had surprised her. "There was a name," she said slowly. She mentioned it once, someone she had spoken to or whose work she had read. A Dr. Adler. She watched Poirot's face as she said it, because people always do watch for a reaction, whether they intend to or not. But Poirot's face, at that particular moment, gave nothing away at all. He thanked her, rose, and crossed to the window. The man in the grey suit had reached the far end of the street and was turning the corner toward the harbour, his briefcase swinging with the economy of purpose. In the lobby behind him, the porter was taking a telephone message. The festival caravan to Prague, Poirot overheard, or was scheduled to depart the following morning. He stood at the window for a little while, his hands clasped behind his back, and looked at the empty street where the man had been. The little grey cells, as he occasionally informed people who found the phrase affected, were not merely a figure of speech. They worked best, he had found, when one gave them space rather than instruction. When one looked at a street and allowed the various facts in one's possession to arrange themselves according to their own affinities, like iron filings settling toward a magnet whose position one has not yet precisely determined. He had a dead woman. He had a map with a sequence. He had a name spoken aloud in a hotel lobby by a grieving sister who did not know what she had just handed him. The filings were moving. The magnet was still hidden, but it was there. Chapter 4. The Caravan Departs. The Prague caravan assembled in the square behind the old fish market at 7 in the morning, and it was, Poirot reflected, rather more festive than the occasion warranted. There were 14 vehicles in all, 3 large lorries carrying amber goods under canvas, a pair of covered wagons fitted out as travelling exhibition spaces, and a loose procession of private motor cars whose owners had elected to follow the official route south for reasons ranging from commerce to sentiment, to, in at least one case that Poirot had identified, the simple pleasure of belonging to something. Banners in amber and gold had been affixed to the lorries. A man with a camera on a tripod was documenting the departure for what appeared to be a local newspaper. 2 children sat on a wall and ate rolls, and watched with the mild approval of those for whom spectacle requires no justification. Poirot stood at the edge of the square and watched the loading with his hands clasped behind his back, and his hat set with precision against the morning chill. Inspector Nowak had, after some negotiation conducted the previous evening by telephone, agreed to share the contents of Elena Kovac's research file. The agreement had been reached on the understanding that Poirot would share, in return, any conclusions to which the little grey cells might lead him. It was, both men understood, an arrangement of mutual convenience that would last precisely as long as it continued to suit them both. The file had been illuminating. Elena had been thorough to a degree that spoke not of professional habit, but of personal necessity. The documents she had assembled covered nearly 70 years. Amber trading records, shipping manifests, correspondence between dealers in 5 countries. But threaded through the commercial records recurring at intervals of several years like a dark stitch through pale fabric, were the other documents. Passenger lists without official stamps, handwritten rosters in a cipher that Eleanor had partially decoded in the margins. Names, sometimes full names, sometimes only first names or initials. Beside notations that indicated origin, destination, and, in a troubling number of cases, a final column left conspicuously blank. Her father's name appeared in a roster dated 1962. The final column was blank. Beside it, in Elena's own handwriting, and a single word, confirmed. There were also, tucked into the back of the file, 3 photographs. 2 showed amber pieces, a brooch and a pendant, of no obvious distinguishing character. The third showed a man at a lectern, apparently delivering a talk to an unseen audience. He was perhaps 50, lean, with a scholar's angular face, and the composed expression of someone entirely at ease before a crowd. On the back of the photograph, in Elena's hand, L.A., Trieste, 2019. Poirot had looked at this photograph for quite some time. He found the man with the grey suit at the edge of the square standing beside a dark blue motorcar of German manufacture with a briefcase placed on the bonnet before him. He was consulting a map, or performing the action of consulting a map. Why would the focused attention of someone who already knows the route perfectly well? Poirot approached with the air of a fellow traveller seeking mild reassurance. "Forgive me," he said. "You are joining the caravan to Prague, I think? I am told the second turning after Prusch is not clearly signed." The man looked up. His eyes were grey, a particular clear grey like winter light on water. And they registered Poirot's presence with a fractional pause that was, in itself, a small piece of information. A man who does not know you pauses to assess. A man who does know you and has decided on a performance pauses to begin it. This was the second kind of pause. "Dr. Adler," Poirot said pleasantly and without inflection before the man could speak. "I believe we have not been formally introduced. My name is Poirot. Doctor. Lucas Adler refolded his map with movements that were, by a small but perceptible margin, too deliberate. He was, seen at close quarters, a man whose surface was extremely well maintained. The suit was excellent. The shoes were polished. The greying hair at his temples was barbered with precision. But the eyes which had performed their brief calculation and now settled into an expression of courteous surprise contained something that all the maintenance in the world could not entirely conceal. Not guilt. Guilt would have been simpler. Something more considered than guilt. The expression of a man who has carried a large weight for a long time and has become so accustomed to its presence that it has ceased to register as burden and has become instead simply the natural condition of standing upright. Monsieur Poirot. He offered his hand. His grip was firm and dry. Your reputation, of course, precedes you. Are you also travelling to Prague? I find that I am, Poirot said. Unexpectedly. The Amber Festival has a way of extending its invitations. Adler smiled. It was a good smile, warm, slightly self-deprecating, the smile of a man practiced in the making of agreeable impressions. The road does tend to draw one forward, he said. That is rather its nature. The road. The same word Elena had used. Poirot filed the coincidence in the precise drawer where it belonged, and gave no sign of having done so. You are a historian of the amber trade, I understand, he said. It must be a rich field. So many centuries of commerce. So many stories moving along those old routes. More than most people appreciate. Adler picked up his briefcase. The amber routes carried a great deal more than amber over the centuries. Ideas, diseases, refugees. The road does not discriminate about its cargo. He said it lightly, as a scholar might say any moderately interesting historical observation. But he was watching Poirot as he said it. And Poirot, who had been watched by cleverer men than Dr. Lucas Adler, smiled back with the benign vacancy of a man whose principal concern is the correct signing of road junctions. The caravan moved out of Gdansk at 7:30 under a sky that had decided, after some deliberation, to remain overcast. Poirot drove in a hired motor car, a reliable if uninspiring Fiat, at a comfortable distance behind the main procession. And he had arranged with Inspector Nowak that a plainclothes officer would travel with the caravan on other pretexts. He had also arranged somewhat more delicately that Katerina would remain in Gdansk for the present. She had accepted this without argument, which suggested that her grief had reached the stage where compliance required less effort than resistance. The road south ran through flat agricultural country, the fields still wet from recent rain. The Baltic light diffused through cloud gave everything the quality of an old photograph. The trees, the farmhouses, the occasional village with its onion-domed church, all rendered in tones of pewter and straw. Amber country. Every field, theoretically, still held its buried millions of years of forest floor. Poirot drove and thought. 3 things occupied him with particular persistence. The first was the photograph of Adler, taken in Trieste, at what appeared to be a conference or auction event 3 years past. Trieste was the 4th and final city on the map fragment found beneath Elena's body, the city beside which no number had yet been written. The second was the harbour master's radio set to its unexplained frequency. Brandt had been present at the dock before the body was discovered, which was not, in itself, remarkable for a harbour master. But a harbour master who hovers at the edge of a police interview and whose radio operates on a frequency not associated with standard harbour communications is a harbour master who knows more than he is performing. The third was the flower girl. She had gone to the harbour immediately after their conversation in the market. She had the specific watchfulness of a child who has been given a task. And Adler, by Poirot's reckoning, had been at the harbour himself in the early morning, before breakfast, in the period that fell neatly between Elena's death and the discovery of her body. He was not yet ready to construct the architecture. The materials were still arriving, but he had the foundation. And he had, which was rather more important, the beginning of an understanding of the mind he was engaged with. Not a reckless mind, not a frantic one. A mind that planned in sequences and that had the particular patience of someone who has waited a very long time for permission to act. The caravan crested a low rise, and for a moment the whole procession was visible ahead of him. The lorries with their amber banners, the private cars strung out along the wet road, all of them moving south together like beads on a string. His eye caught movement at the side of the road, a lay-by just past the rise. A telephone box, its door hanging open. A figure inside speaking with the compressed urgency of someone delivering a message that cannot wait. The figure was Yannick, the cafe waiter who had no business being on this road in this lay-by, making this call, was watching the caravan pass with the expression of a man crossing items off a list. Poirot drove past at the same steady pace and did not look directly at him. In the mirror, the telephone box receded. Yannick emerged from it, watched the last car pass, and walked back toward a bicycle propped against the hedge. Not part of the caravan then, but travelling in his own way in the same direction. The road, as Dr. Adler had remarked, did tend to draw one forward. Poirot pressed the accelerator with the measured firmness of a man who has identified the shape of the trap and intends this time to arrive at its centre before anyone else does. Chapter 5. Questions without answers. Prague received the caravan with the indifference of a city that has seen too much history to be impressed by pageantry. The lorries were directed to a courtyard near the old Jewish quarter, where a temporary exhibition space had been erected beneath canvas awnings in amber and white. The private motorcars dispersed to various hotels across the Mala Strana and the new town, with the purposeful scatter of iron filings released from a magnet. By evening, the city had absorbed the festival entirely, and the amber dealers of 6 nations were installed in restaurants and hotel bars, conducting the specific, oblique commerce of people for whom every social occasion is also a professional one. Poirot took a room at a small hotel on a cobbled lane off the Nerudova, chosen for its quietness and its view of a chestnut tree, rather than for any amenity. He unpacked with the methodical care that he applied to all domestic operations, placed the amber bead on the bedside table in its now customary position, and sat for 20 minutes in the single armchair doing nothing visible at all. And then he went out to call on the man whose name Elena Kovacs had written in the margins of a decoded cipher beside the notation. Handler, Route 3, active 1959 to 71. The man's name was Benedict Horak. He was 73 years old and had operated for the better part of 4 decades as one of Prague's most respected dealers in antique amber. His shop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on the Seletna, between a bookshop and a silversmith, and had the slightly dim, reverential atmosphere of a place where objects are taken seriously. Cases of amber lined 3 walls. A lamp on the counter threw a warm honey light across everything, so that the room appeared to be illuminated from within, like the stones themselves. Horak was behind the counter when Poirot entered. He was a small man, considerably diminished by age, here with a neat white beard and the careful, unhurried movements of someone who has learned to conserve. His eyes behind round spectacles were sharp and very dark, and took Poirot's measure in a single glance with a speed that the rest of his manner did not advertise. Poirot browsed for a few minutes, which was not entirely a pretence. The pieces were genuinely fine. He paused before a case containing a brooch of Baltic amber set in silver, the stone holding at its centre a fragment of what appeared to be ancient plant matter, a seed or perhaps a thorn. "Eocene," said Horak from behind the counter without being asked. 44 million years. The plant material is probably a fragment of a gymnosperm. Nothing so dramatic as an insect, but its own kind of record. "You are fond of records," Poirot said pleasantly. A pause. Not long. 3 seconds perhaps, but of a quality that Poirot noted. "It is the nature of the trade," Horak said. "Amber is itself a record. Everything it touches, it preserves." Everything. Poirot turned from the case and met the old man's eyes. "That must be both its virtue and its difficulty." Horak looked at him steadily. The lamp between them threw the lower half of his face into warm relief and left his eyes in relative shadow, which was the kind of accidental advantage that some people would have arranged deliberately. "You are Poirot," he said. "Not a question. I am, and you know why I am here." The old man was silent for a moment. Then he came out from behind the counter with the careful, considered motion of someone making a decision about more than movement, whilst then he crossed to the door of the shop and turned the sign to closed. "Sit down," he said. "I've been expecting someone to come. I did not expect it to be you, but that is perhaps appropriate." What Horak told him over the next 40 minutes was not a confession. It was something more complicated, the account of a man who had done wrong things within a system so thoroughly wrong that the individual transactions had seemed at the time like the least available evil. He spoke without self-pity, which Poirot respected, and without excessive self-exculpation, which he respected rather more. He had been young and poor and frightened, in a city under a regime that collected information about its citizens the way other cities collected taxes, relentlessly, impersonally, with no particular malice and no particular mercy. He had been recruited into the network not because he was especially suited to it, but because he owned premises through which amber passed regularly, which meant that other things could pass through them as well, concealed in shipments, documented under false manifests. Sometimes the things were objects, sometimes they were people. "I want to be precise with you," Horak said. "I did not choose the passengers. I did not speak to them. I received a shipment and I passed it on and I was paid, and I did not look into the crates." "And when the passengers did not arrive," Poirot said quietly, "you also did not look into that." A long silence. Outside, a tram passed. The amber in the cases glowed with its patient, independent warmth. "No," Horak said, "I did not." He removed his spectacles and polished them with a cloth from his pocket, which was the action of a man who needs something to do with his hands. "There were 5 of us on this particular route," he continued, "at different points along the road. I was Prague. There was a man in Trieste who coordinated, a man in Vienna who managed documentation, a woman in Gdansk who controlled the initial shipments." He replaced his spectacles. "And a man who was, I suppose you would say, the architect, who designed the system and who ensured it continued operating." "Their names," Poirot said. The woman in Gdansk is dead. I read it this morning. Elena Kovac. She was investigating the network, had been for years. She was not one of us. But she had found the documents. He paused. The others. The man in Vienna died 4 years ago, naturally. The woman in Gdansk controlled the amber side. And the coordinator in Trieste, a collector, a man of means, is still living, still attending auctions, still moving through the world as though none of it happened. And the architect? Poirot asked. Horak looked at him carefully. I never knew his real name. None of us did. He was known on the route as the carrier. He communicated only through the amber. Pieces passed between us carried embedded messages. A code system of some elegance, I admit. Something passed across his face that might, in another context, have been reluctant admiration. We were told he had reasons of his own for what he built, that it had not always been about money. But it became about money. Everything becomes about money, Horak said with the weary authority of a man stating a natural law. Eventually. Poirot stood and walked slowly to the nearest case of amber, his hands still clasped behind his back. He looked at the pieces without seeing them. The coordinator in Trieste, he said. He will be at the amber auction next week. He is always at the Trieste auction. He has attended every year for 30 years. It is, I believe, the only occasion on which he still moves amber of the old kind. The old kind meaning smuggled. The old kind meaning pieces carrying messages. Whether there is still anyone to receive them. Horak spread his hands. Poirot turned. There was something in the old dealer's manner that he had been observing throughout the conversation with increasing attention. Not deception, precisely, but a form of selective presentation. The account was truthful as far as it went. But truthful accounts that go only so far are among the most common instruments of misdirection Poirot had encountered. You have been contacted recently, he said. Not by Elena Kovac, by someone else, someone who knew about the network and knew your role in it. Horak's hands were very still on the counter. A letter, he said after a moment. 6 weeks ago. No signature. It said only that the carrier was settling accounts, that the men and women of Route 3 would answer for the passengers who had not arrived. His voice was entirely level. I did not know what to make of it. I think, Poirot said gently, that you knew precisely what to make of it. I think that is why you were expecting someone to come. He left Horak in his lamp-lit shop among his 40-million-year records and walked back out into the cobbled lane, where the chestnut trees were beginning to thin toward autumn, and the evening air carried the first suggestion of cold. He had the network now. 5 positions. 3 of the 5 were accounted for. 1 dead in Gdansk, 1 dead in Vienna, 1 frightened and waiting in Prague. The coordinator in Trieste was still at liberty and still, apparently, operational in the old sense. And the carrier, the architect, the unnamed intelligence at the centre, was settling accounts by a method that left amber stones on the chests of its victims, like calling cards pressed on a silver tray. The question that mattered was not who the carrier was. Poirot rather thought he knew that. The question that mattered was whether the carrier intended, when the accounts were settled, to leave anyone standing, including, perhaps, Hercule Poirot himself. He touched the breast pocket of his jacket and felt the slight weight of the amber bead through the linen. The fly inside it had been interrupted 40 million years ago in an action it would never complete. Poirot had no intention of sharing its fate. Chapter 6. The Beetle and the Warehouse. He was being followed. He had known it since the Seletna. The person behind him was not without skill. They held their distance with discipline, varied their pace at intersections, and twice used the window reflections of shop fronts in a manner that indicated professional training of some kind. But there is a quality to genuine invisibility that even competent surveillance cannot always produce. A quality of absence, of negative space. And this person had not quite achieved it. Poirot was aware of them, as one is aware of a draught in a room that appears sealed, not through any single identifiable source, but through the accumulated evidence of small, persistent discomforts. He did not alter his pace. He walked with the meditative unhurriedness of a man digesting a conversation, which was not entirely a performance, and turned onto the Karlova heading towards the river. The bridge was crowded even in the early evening. Tourists, a brass ensemble, 2 monks in brown habits who appeared to be lost. Poirot stopped at the 3rd statue from the tower and studied it with apparent absorption, using the interval to confirm what his peripheral vision had been suggesting for the past 10 minutes. The person following him was Janek, the cafe waiter from Gdansk, who had no legitimate reason to be in Prague, who had been seen using a telephone box on the road south with the compressed urgency of a man reporting to someone, was now standing at the near end of the bridge pretending to buy a postcard with an industry entirely inconsistent with his previous commercial indifference. He was perhaps 28. Under the watchfulness and the evident anxiety, there was something that Poirot found himself examining with interest. Not the anxiety of a guilty man, which has a particular flavour, sharp and self-focused, but the anxiety of a man carrying information he does not know what to do with. Poirot turned from the statue and walked directly towards him. Janek froze with the postcard in his hand in the manner of a man whose contingency plans have run out. "Sit down with me," Poirot said pleasantly, in the tone one uses to someone who has been standing for too long. "There is a bench at the far side, and I find the river is best appreciated from a position of repose." They sat. Below them, the Vltava moved with its dark, deliberate weight, carrying a single long barge upriver against the current. The brass ensemble behind them launched into something with ambitions above its station. Janek held the postcard in both hands and looked at the water. "You have been following me since I left the amber dealer's shop," Poirot said. "Before that, you telephoned someone from the lay-by on the Gdansk road. Before that, you watched the harbour in Gdansk with a regularity that suggested purpose rather than habit." He paused. "You may tell me that I am mistaken, if you like. It will not be a productive use of either of our evenings." Janek was silent for a moment. Then he said, in English that had the careful construction of someone who had learned it from books rather than from speaking, "I was told to watch for you." "By whom?" Another silence, briefer. "By my father." Poirot turned his head and looked at the young man properly for the first time since they had sat down. The dark eyes, the particular quality of the watchfulness. Not the watchfulness of suspicion, but of devotion, which is a different thing entirely, though it can produce similar behaviour from the outside. "Tell me about your father," Poirot said. What emerged over the next quarter of an hour was not a story so much as the visible surface of a story whose depth Poirot could only estimate. And Janek's father had survived the amber route as a young man. Survived it in the literal sense, meaning that he had been placed in a shipment and had arrived at his destination alive, which was not a guarantee the route had consistently provided. He had come to understand over the following decades what the route had been. Not a rescue operation, not a kindness, but a commerce in human beings conducted behind the amber trade as reliably and as profitably as the amber trade itself. He had spent 30 years finding out who had run it. He told me, Yannick said, that there were 5 people at the important positions, that the woman in Gdansk, Elena Kovac, had found the same documents he had found independently, and that they had been working in parallel for 2 years, without knowing it. He looked down at the postcard, which was slightly crumpled now from handling. He was afraid for her. He tried to warn her. He sent her to find me, Poirot said. Yannick nodded. And the amber bead. It was his. From the original shipment, he had kept 1 bead from the crate he was transported in. He said it was important that you understand from the beginning what kind of object you were dealing with. Something that looks like preservation but is really... He stopped. Entrapment, Poirot said quietly. The young man nodded again and swallowed. Your father, Poirot said after a moment. Where is he now? Yannick looked at him steadily. He is in Prague. He has been here for 4 days. He intends to go to Trieste. The weight of this settled between them with the solidity of the barge passing below. Slow, deliberate, and carrying more than was apparent from the bank. He intends, Poirot said carefully, to be present when the coordinator is dealt with. He intends, Yannick said with a precision that the phrase required, to deal with him himself. The warehouse was on the edge of the Holesovis district, in a street of similar buildings that had the particular quality of industrial areas at night, purposeful in the day, purposeless after dark, and in their purposelessness oddly threatening. Inspector Nowak's counterpart in Prague, a Detective Sergeant Mares of impressive brevity, had made available the information that a secondary amber storage facility registered to one of the caravan's commercial participants had been flagged the previous year in connection with an unresolved customs irregularity. The irregularity had been administrative, and the case had been closed. But the address remained on a list. Poirot went to the warehouse at 9 o'clock, which was perhaps not the wisest decision he had made in a long career containing several unwisest decisions. But wisdom, he had found, occasionally required the sacrifice of caution, and the materials of the case were assembling toward a conclusion, with a speed that made delay feel less like prudence and more like abdication. The side door was unlocked, which was itself a form of invitation that Poirot did not mistake for carelessness. Inside, the smell of resin and old timber, and, beneath it, something else. A chemical astringency that did not belong to amber. Crates were stacked in orderly rows, each labelled in the amber trade's particular commercial shorthand. The single overhead bulb threw stark shadows, and left the far end of the warehouse in a darkness that the eye adjusted to, only slowly and incompletely. He found the stone on top of the 3rd crate in the 2nd row. He had not had to search for it. It had been placed where it would be seen by someone who entered from the side door and moved along the natural path of the available light. Amber. Inside it, a beetle, heavy, armoured, its legs drawn in as though bracing against something. He turned it in his fingers. Then he saw the note beneath it, folded once, addressed in the same precise and characterless hand he had last seen on a card in a dead woman's coat pocket. Too slow, Monsieur Poirot. He stood quite still and read it again. Behind him, from somewhere in the upper darkness of the warehouse, came a sound, the slow and deliberate shift of weight on timber, followed by a silence that was somehow louder than the sound had been. He did not turn immediately. He was listening to the silence, reading it, calculating the distance and the angle and what they implied about the intention behind them. A man who means to act does not hold his position for this length of time. A man who is making a point does. The crate to his left dropped 2 inches without warning, its supporting pallet giving way beneath some redistributed weight from above. And Poirot stepped aside with a speed that surprised even himself, moving to the right as the crate above it tipped and fell with a crash that shook the floor and sent a cloud of resin dust across the aisle where he had been standing. He stood in the dust and the ringing silence and straightened his jacket. His hat, which had remained on his head throughout the operation, required a single small adjustment. He looked up into the darkness above the crates. Nothing. No further sound. Whoever had been there, if anyone had been there, and the crate's fall might have been entirely mechanical, though he did not believe it for a moment, was gone. But the note was still in his hand. He was being told something, not threatened, or not only threatened, told. The killer had known he would visit Horak, had known he would come here afterward, had placed the stone and the note, and arranged the falling crate in a sequence designed to communicate a specific message, that Poirot's movements were known, that his deductions were anticipated, and that the gap between them was, in the killer's estimation, still wide enough to matter. He walked out of the warehouse into the cold air and stood for a moment on the empty street. In his experience, people who told you that you were too slow were people who needed you to hurry. And people who needed you to hurry were people for whom haste in an opponent was a functional requirement. He was being managed. The recognition was not humbling, it was clarifying. He looked at the beetle in the amber, braced and armoured against its ancient catastrophe, and placed it with great care in his breast pocket beside the fly. 2 pieces, 3 creatures, 1 road. He knew where it ended. The question was whether he could arrive there first. Chapter 7. The Spider's Geometry. The truck exploded at 6:20 in the evening on a bridge above a river whose name Poirot did not immediately know, and the sound reached him 3 seconds after the light. A flat, percussive crack, followed by the lower register of combustion, which is a duller and more sustained thing than the cinema generally represents. He had been travelling parallel to the main caravan road in the hired Fiat, having elected that morning to leave the direct route and follow instead a secondary road that ran perhaps 4 kilometres to the west. The decision had been made for reasons he had described to himself as the desire to think without the distraction of familiar vehicles ahead of him, which was true as far as it went. The deeper reason, which he had not articulated even privately, was that a man who knows he is being managed ought not to remain on the managed route. He pulled the car to the verge and sat for a moment. The light from the bridge was visible above the tree line. Orange against the grey dusk, without urgency now, simply burning. He drove toward it. By the time he reached the scene, the local fire brigade had arrived, and the police were establishing a perimeter with the slightly bewildered efficiency of people accustomed to accidents rather than events. The truck, one of the Amber Caravan's cargo vehicles, the second of 3, had stopped on the bridge and burned from the cab backward. The fire was largely out. The damage was confined with a precision that a genuinely accidental explosion does not produce, to a single compartment of the cargo bed. 1 person had died, a man named Otto Brenner, listed in the caravan's documentation as a freight coordinator from Vienna. Poirot stood at the perimeter tape and looked at what remained of the truck for a long time. Vienna. documentation. The network's Vienna position, the man Horak had described as managing the paperwork, who had died 4 years ago naturally, had left, apparently, at least one successor, or one associate, or one man who had known too much for too long about the wrong things, and whose particular moment of accounting had arrived on this particular bridge at 6:20 on a Tuesday evening. He asked a young constable in his most courteous and least threatening manner whether anything had been found near the wreckage. The constable, who was perhaps 22 and still at the stage of his career when a small, precise foreigner with impeccable shoes asking questions at a crime scene seems reassuring rather than anomalous, I told him yes. A small stone, amber, found on the metal of the truck's running board, still warm from the fire. Poirot thanked him and did not ask what was inside the stone. He already knew it would be a spider. He found Adler at the hotel in the next town, where the undamaged caravan vehicles had been directed, pending police clearance of the Bridge Road. The hotel was a large, indifferent establishment of the kind that caters to commercial travellers and asks no interesting questions, and its dining room was occupied by a dozen members of the caravan who were managing the specific discomfort of people who have witnessed or been near to a violent death and do not know the social form for it. They ate with the slightly accelerated purpose of those who feel that continuing to eat is, under the circumstances, a form of moral courage. Adler was not among them. Poirot found him in the residence lounge, which was empty, seated in a chair by the window with a glass of brandy and no book and no newspaper, and nothing at all to suggest that he was doing anything other than sitting with his own thoughts. He looked up when Poirot entered, and something crossed his face briefly. Not surprise, not apprehension, something that was, if Poirot was reading it correctly, very close to relief. That was interesting. "Sit down, Monsieur Poirot." Adler gestured to the adjacent chair. "I imagine we have things to discuss." "I imagine so," Poirot agreed, and sat, and said nothing further for a moment. It was a technique he had employed for 50 years with consistent results. The person who speaks first into a silence of this kind is the person for whom silence costs more. He waited to see what Adler's silence cost him. It cost him, it turned out, approximately 90 seconds. "You know about Brenner," Adler said. Not a question. "I do. Vienna. Documentation. The second position on the route, by Horak's accounting." Adler looked at him steadily. Then, with the deliberate movement of a man putting down a weight he has been carrying at some personal expense, he set his brandy glass on the table beside him and folded his hands in his lap. "How much have you assembled?" he asked. "Enough," Poirot said. "Perhaps not quite all. Tell me what you think I am missing." It was, as an interrogation technique, somewhat unorthodox. But he had learned over the years that unorthodox techniques produce unorthodox responses, and he was no longer interested in the orthodox ones. Adler was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had shed the polished social surface that Poirot had heard at every previous encounter. Not entirely, but sufficiently that what remained underneath was audible. Something tired, something old in a way that had nothing to do with age. "I was 12 when my father was placed in a shipment on the Amber route," he said. "He did not survive it. I was told he had emigrated. That story held for 11 years, until I found the documentation myself in the course of academic research that had nothing to do with him." He paused. "It is a peculiar experience, discovering the truth of something you had already, without knowing it, spent 11 years preparing to understand. Poirot said nothing. The room was very quiet. Somewhere above them, a floorboard registered a guest moving between rooms, and then silence resumed. I built my career on the amber roots, genuinely. The scholarship is real. I want to be precise about that. But yes, I built it in order to have access to the records. And yes, it took me 22 years to identify all 5 positions with certainty. He looked at Poirot directly. Eleanor Kovacs reached the same conclusions by a different road. When I found out she existed, I was not pleased. I had not anticipated a parallel investigation. It complicated the timing. "And so you warned her," Poirot said, "through Yannick's father, who had also been working along the same lines." A fractional hesitation. Then, yes. "And then someone killed her before your warning reached her." The silence that followed this was of a different quality from the others. Adler's hands, still folded in his lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, yes," he said again. His voice was entirely level. "That was not part of my arrangement." Poirot rose after a few minutes and went to the window. The road outside was dark, the caravan vehicles parked in a line along the verge with their amber banners hanging limp in the still air. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at them. He was reconfiguring. For most of the journey from Gdansk, he had been constructing a model that placed Adler at the centre. The evidence supported it. Adler's presence at every point on the route, his expertise in the amber communication system, his access to the network's records, the photograph in Elena's file. The model was internally consistent and it pointed cleanly toward Trieste. But a model that accounts for all the available evidence is not necessarily correct. It is merely the most economical explanation of what one has chosen to observe. And Poirot had been, he now suspected, observing the wrong centre. Elena had been killed. Adler had not killed her. He was by his own account attempting to warn her, and the timeline of the warning, which Yannick's account supported, was consistent with that. But someone had known about Elena. Someone had known with enough precision and enough advance notice to intercept her at the harbour before the warning arrived. Someone who had been watching the watchers. He thought about Horak in his lamplit shop in Prague, who had told his account with such careful completeness and had volunteered the anonymous letter precisely when it was most useful to do so. Who had been, by his own admission, waiting for someone to come, who had been so very forthcoming about everyone on the route except the person he had described as the coordinator in Trieste. "The coordinator," Poirot said, still looking at the window. "You said Horak described him to me as a collector, a man of means, still attending the Trieste auction. That is what he is. And Horak knows him by name, by face, by 30 years of shared silence." He turned from the window. "Adler, when you assembled your list of the 5 positions, when you identified each person, at what point did you identify the coordinator?" Adler frowned slightly. "Last. He was the most carefully concealed. He operated through intermediaries and never, as far as I could determine, appeared in any documentation directly. And yet Horak, who was Prague, knew him personally." A pause. Adler sat up slightly. "Horak told you he did not know the carrier's real name," he said slowly. "He told me he did not know the carrier. He was rather careful to distinguish between the carrier and the coordinator." Poirot retrieved his hat from the side table and placed it with precision. "It is a distinction I confess I did not attend to sufficiently at the time." He looked at Adler. Adler looked back at him with the expression of a man running a calculation he had not previously thought to run, arriving at a number he did not entirely welcome. "Horak has been in contact with the coordinator," Adler said. "I think Horak has been in the coordinator's employ for rather longer than he indicated," Poirot said. "And I think Elena Kovacs was killed not because someone discovered her investigation. She was killed because Horak reported it." The amber banners outside hung without movement in the windless dark. Trieste was 300 kilometers south, and the auction opened in 4 days. Poirot put on his hat, thanked Adler for the brandy he had not been offered, and went to find a telephone. Chapter 8. The Smoke and the Mirror. He telephoned Nowak from the hotel lobby at 10:30, using the instrument behind the reception desk after a brief and entirely successful negotiation with the night porter. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. At its conclusion, Poirot had confirmed 3 things: that Horak had not, as it transpired, remained in Prague following their meeting, but had departed by train that same evening; that the train's destination, according to a cooperative station master whose cooperation owed something to the persuasive authority of Inspector Nowak's badge number, was Trieste via Vienna; and that the flower girl, whose name, it had now been established, was Marta, had been collected from Gdansk by a woman answering a general description consistent with a maternal aunt, and conveyed to a residential address in Krakow, where she was, by all available evidence, safe. The last piece of information was the one that settled something in Poirot's chest that had been taut since the bridge. He replaced the receiver and stood for a moment with his hand still resting on it, organizing. Horak moving south on the same night their conversation had concluded meant one of 2 things. Or either the old dealer had been alarmed by Poirot's deductions and had gone to warn the coordinator directly, which suggested his loyalties remained intact, and his confession had been a controlled disclosure designed to send Poirot chasing a version of events that served the coordinator's purposes. Or Horak had decided, after 30 years of complicit silence, that the settling of accounts applied to him as well, and had gone to Trieste to participate in it rather than await its arrival. Both explanations were possible. They were not, however, equally consistent with the specific texture of the man's manner in that lamp-lit shop. The spectacles polished, the hands deliberate, the confession measuring itself out with such careful completeness. A man performing a misdirection does not leave quite so much genuine residue around the edges. Poirot went to bed at 11 and slept, which was itself a form of discipline. Trieste in late September had the quality of a city holding its breath between seasons. The summer's tourists had largely retreated, and the Bora, that cold, aggressive wind peculiar to the northern Adriatic, had not yet arrived in full force, though one could sense its imminence in the way the locals moved through the streets with a slight forward lean, as if already bracing. The sea was the colour of pewter shot through with silver, and the light had the clear, flat quality that belongs to coastal cities at the end of summer, when the haze burns off and distances become exact. Poirot drove into the city on the 2nd of October with Adler in the passenger seat, an arrangement that would have struck him as imprudent a week earlier, and that he now regarded as the most practical available option. Adler knew the city, knew the auction house, and had attended the Amber exhibition 3 times in the previous decade under the entirely legitimate professional cover of his academic work. He was, in the most specific sense, Poirot's best map. He was also, Poirot had concluded, a man who had set an extremely careful and long-prepared trap, and who had watched, with growing frustration, as it was sprung by the wrong mechanism. The murders along the road were his work. Elena was the exception, the wound he had not intended and could not undo. But the architecture was his, the amber stones, the numbered sequence, the deliberate announcement. He had wanted the coordinator to know that someone was coming. He had wanted the fear of it. He had wanted the man to understand, city by city, that the road he had built for profit was being dismantled by someone it had damaged. Poirot had no illusions about this. He had worked alongside complicated men before. "The auction opens tomorrow evening," Adler said as they crossed the city toward the waterfront. "The coordinator will be there from the morning. He has a standing arrangement with the house, a private viewing before the public opening." "His name," Poirot said. "Victor Renz. He is 71. He operates through a foundation nominally dedicated to cultural preservation, Baltic heritage, amber research, that sort of thing. He has been entirely respectable for 40 years. A pause containing several layers of irony. He funds academic chairs. He has received a decoration from the Austrian government. And 30 years ago, he coordinated the movement of people in cargo shipments along a trade route, for profit. Yes. The sea appeared at the end of a long, straight street, flat and precise, and enormous. "And Horak," Poirot said. "What is Horak to Renz?" Adler was quiet for a moment. When he answered, the tiredness in his voice had a particular quality. Not the tiredness of a man who has been travelling, but of one who has been carrying something for a very long time and is beginning to consider the mechanics of setting it down. Horak's shop was the Prague position on the route, but he was also, I believe, something more personal to Renz, a kind of confidential agent, someone who managed things that required a trusted pair of hands in a city where Renz preferred not to appear directly. An arrangement that persisted, Poirot said, long after the route was formally discontinued. Renz does not discontinue arrangements. He lets them go dormant and reactivates them when he requires them. Horak has been dormant for 20 years, until Elena. The Amber exhibition was housed in a converted warehouse 3 streets from the waterfront, and its transformation from industrial to cultural had been accomplished with the kind of money that does not draw attention to itself. The walls were pale stone. The cases were lit from within. The catalogue, which Poirot collected from a table near the entrance on the morning of the 3rd, was a handsome thing. Cream paper, amber-coloured text, was scholarly in its annotations. He walked through the exhibition alone and without apparent purpose, which was his preferred method of acquiring a great deal of it. The pieces were remarkable. He paused before a Roman-era pendant, a medieval reliquary mount, a set of Renaissance gaming pieces in matched Baltic amber of extraordinary clarity. He paused longer before a case near the far wall containing what the catalogue described as a private collection of Hanseatic period amber pieces, the property of the Victor Renz Foundation for Cultural Heritage. The pieces themselves were fine, but Poirot was not looking at the pieces. He was looking at the case's interior construction, specifically at the fitted velvet base, which had been manufactured to accommodate the displayed items with a precision that left no wasted space. It was the work of a craftsman. It was also the work of a craftsman who had built cases like this before, for purposes that had nothing to do with display, and whose instinct for concealed compartmentalization had left its signature in the slightly excessive depth of the base, relative to what the visible contents required. He straightened. He consulted his catalogue. He made a small penciled annotation in the margin beside the Wren's Foundation entry and moved on. He found Yannick's father at a cafe table on the waterfront at noon. The man's name was Thomas Novak, and he was 64 years old, and he looked it in the manner of someone who has spent those years doing something more demanding than living comfortably. He was a large man, reduced by time rather than built by it, with the bearing of someone who had once been physically formidable and retained the skeleton of that quality without its former substance. His eyes were Yannick's eyes, dark and watchful. But where Yannick's watchfulness had the quality of a trained observer, his father's had the quality of a man who has looked at a fixed point for so long that the looking has become indistinguishable from the man himself. He did not appear surprised to see Poirot. He gestured to the opposite chair. "My son told me you would come," he said. His English was accented but direct. "Sit down. I will tell you what you need to know." "I think," Poirot said gently, settling himself, "that you will tell me rather more than that." What Thomas Novak told him over the following hour revised Poirot's architecture in ways that were not dramatic, but was in their cumulative effect, transformative. The route had not been simply a criminal enterprise. In its original form, before Wren's had taken control of it, before profit had displaced whatever initial motive had preceded it, it had been something else, an escape corridor, used to move people westward during a period when westward movement was not officially available. It had been corrupted slowly, incrementally, by the replacement of idealism with commerce, and by the time Thomas Novak had been placed in a shipment, the route had been Wren's operation entirely for nearly a decade. The man who had built it originally, the true architect, the one Horak had called the carrier, had died in 1971. Wren's had inherited the infrastructure and changed its purpose. Poirot sat with this for a moment. "The murders along the route," he said carefully. "Elena, Brenner. You understand that the man responsible for those is also in this city." Thomas Novak looked at him with a directness that contained no evasion and no apology. "I know," he said. "I have known since Prague." "And Wren's," Poirot continued. "He is in this city as well. He attended a private viewing this morning. He is at this moment, perhaps 400 meters from where we are sitting." The old man's hands rested flat on the table. He did not look toward the exhibition warehouse. "Then there is not much time," he said. "No," Poirot agreed. He looked across the harbour at the flat pewter sea, then back at the man opposite him. "There is not. Which is why I must ask you to trust me. Not because I am asking you to abandon your purpose, but because I am asking you to allow me to serve it better than a confrontation will." Thomas Novak was silent for a long time. A gull passed overhead with a single flat cry. "Adler said the same thing to me in Prague," he said at last. I did not believe him. "No," said Poirot, "but you came to the café nonetheless." Another silence. Then, with the gravity of a man making a decision he has been postponing for 30 years. "What do you need from me?" Poirot told him. Outside, the Adriatic held its pewter light, and the amber in the cases across the street glowed with its patient, enclosed warmth. And somewhere in the city, Victor Wren's moved through his afternoon with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never, in 40 years, had serious reason to look over his shoulder. That was about to change. Chapter 9. The Checkmate at the Harbour. He made his announcement at noon on the 4th of October in the Amber Exhibition's reading room before an audience of 9 people. The audience comprised Victor Renz, who had been invited by the exhibition director at Poirot's request, and who sat in the front row with the composed attention of a man accustomed to being important in rooms. Benedict Horak, who had arrived from the overnight train looking considerably older than he had appeared in his Prague shop and who had taken the chair nearest the door with the instinct of someone estimating distances. Adler, seated to one side with the stillness of a man who has waited 22 years for this particular morning. Thomas Novak at the back, his hands on his knees. Inspector Nowak, who had driven from Gdansk through the night and whose suit, and under the circumstances, was forgivably rumpled. Two officers of the Trieste police, whose presence Poirot had arranged through Nowak's professional courtesies, and, at Poirot's specific request, a notary from the city whose function would become apparent. He had also, as an afterthought that was not entirely an afterthought, placed a small amber bead, a fly inside it, wings spread, suspended in its 40-million-year interruption, on the table before him. He did not refer to it. He did not need to. He began, as he had always preferred to begin, not with the conclusion, but with the room as it had first appeared to him. A cafe table in Gdansk, a woman sitting down without invitation, 4 words that had not explained themselves until he had walked their meaning the length of an ancient road. He spoke for 20 minutes without notes. Yoshu the network, he explained, had operated along the amber trade route for approximately 15 years, using the established infrastructure of amber shipments, their scale, their regularity, their legitimate complexity, as cover for the movement of human cargo. The original architect of the route had not designed it for profit. The documentation Elena Kovacs had assembled, cross-referenced with what Thomas Novak had provided, was consistent with an escape corridor of genuine purpose, created during a period when such corridors were a matter of life and consequence for a great many people. It had been a worthy thing, corruptly inherited. Victor Renz had taken control of the route in the early 1960s. Under his management, the humanitarian purpose was replaced entirely by commerce. Now, people moved along the route not because they were fleeing, but because someone had paid for their passage, or because someone had paid for their disappearance. The distinction between these categories had, on several occasions, proved fatal. Renz listened to this with the composed interest of a man hearing a moderately engaging academic paper delivered on a subject tangentially related to his own research. His hands were folded on his knee. His expression was attentive without being engaged. It was, Poirot noted, a very accomplished performance. He continued. The amber communication system, pieces passed between dealers carrying messages encoded in the type and arrangement of their inclusions, had been Renz's most elegant innovation. It required no written correspondence, left no electronic trace, and operated invisibly within a trade whose practitioners were accustomed to the close examination of small objects and the attribution of significance to minute physical details. A fly indicated an initial contact. An ant confirmed a transaction. A spider acknowledged completion. A beetle, the heaviest, most armoured of the sequence, signalled danger. "You will note," Poirot said, looking directly at Renz for the first time, "that the sequence was turned against itself. The killer used your own system to announce each death. The stones left on the bodies were not random. They were communications, addressed to you specifically, in a language you had designed and that only you and your associates would recognize." Something shifted in Renz's composed expression. It was very small and very quickly suppressed. But it had been there, he continued. When he had walked through the Foundation's display cases the previous morning, the velvet base of the central case had been disturbed, recently and in haste. The concealed compartment beneath it was empty. "You received the message from Gdansk," he told Renz, "and from the highway bridge, and you understood what they meant." Horak made a small sound that was not quite a word. "Whatever had been stored there for safekeeping," Poirot said, "you removed it yesterday afternoon, after my visit, because you realized that the announcement I had made through the exhibition director, that I had identified the killer, was not the comfortable piece of news it appeared. It was an instruction to the killer to move immediately, before whatever you held could be secured." He paused. "The object you removed from the case is presently in your hotel room, in the lining of the larger of your 2 travelling bags. This is because it is an object you do not trust to any safe that is not your own, which means it is an object whose value to you is not financial." The room was extremely quiet. Even Inspector Nowak, who had heard the outline of this in the car from Gdansk and was not easily surprised, had gone very still. Renz spoke for the first time. "This is a remarkable performance, Monsieur Poirot." His voice was mild, even appreciative. "But a performance is what it is. You have described a network that existed, if it existed, 60 years ago. The people most directly implicated in your account are, with certain exceptions present in this room, dead. I am a cultural philanthropist with a 30-year public record. You have, as far as I can determine, one piece of documentary evidence, the research file of a woman who drowned." "Who was murdered?" Poirot said pleasantly. "Who drowned?" Renz repeated. "The Gdansk coroner is yet to rule otherwise." "The Gdansk coroner," said Inspector Nowak from the back of the room, in a tone that suggested this particular consideration would shortly be resolved, "has been provided with additional pathological evidence gathered this week. His ruling is expected to change." Renz absorbed this. He unfolded his hands and refolded them, which was the first involuntary movement he had made since sitting down. "Furthermore," Poirot continued, in the conversational tone of someone adding an item to a list, "the object in the lining of your travelling bag is, I believe, the original ledger of the route, the master record, kept in your own hand of every passage, every transaction, and every name. You kept it, I suspect, for the same reason that men of your particular temperament always keep such things, because information is power, and the ledger represented power over everyone who had ever used the route or been used by it, including the people in this room." He had expected Renz to deny it. What he had not expected, or had expected only as a remote and not particularly welcome possibility, was what Renz actually did, which was to produce a thin, genuine smile and incline his head with the faint acknowledgement of one skilled player recognizing the move of another. "You are more thorough than I anticipated," Renz said. "When Horak told me a Belgian detective had been asking questions in Gdansk, I thought the situation manageable." Horak, in his chair by the door, appeared to have contracted slightly. "The ledger," Poirot said. "You will surrender it to Inspector Nowak." "And if I decline?" "Then the Trieste police, who have this morning obtained a warrant on the basis of evidence I provided yesterday evening, will search your hotel room and find it in any case. The warrant," he added, with the mild precision of a man noting an incidental detail, "also covers the exhibition cases. I suspect the notary will find the process instructive." The notary, a small man who had sat throughout with the expression of someone attending a performance in a language he does not quite speak, straightened slightly at this. Rennes looked at Poirot for a long moment. Then he looked for the first time at Adler, a look of such particular quality that Poirot watched it with interest. Oh, it was not the look of a man regarding a threat. It was the look of a man regarding something he had, at some level, expected. Something that had been coming for a very long time and had finally, unremarkably, arrived. "You were on the route," Rennes said to Adler. The words were entirely level. "Your father." "Yes," said Adler. A silence of perhaps 5 seconds, which was, in context, a considerable length of time. "I see," said Rennes. And then, with the economy of a man who knows when a position is lost. "Very well." He turned to Inspector Nowak and gave the room number of his hotel. It was Adler who spoke to Poirot afterward. "You, while the police were occupied with Rennes and the notary, was reviewing the contents of the display case with the absorbed expression of a man whose afternoon has become considerably more interesting than anticipated." "You said you had identified the killer," Adler said, "in your announcement to the director. That was for Rennes, to pressure him into moving the ledger." "It served 2 purposes," Poirot said. "It was also intended to communicate to you that there was no longer any need for further action on your part, that the road, as you had designed it, had reached its terminus by another route." Adler was quiet for a moment, looking at the amber cases with their warm, enclosed light. "Gdansk," he said. "I did not kill Elena Kovacs." "I know," Poirot said. "Horak passed her name to Rennes. Rennes arranged it. He will answer for it. The additional pathological evidence Nowak mentioned is rather conclusive on the matter of method." He paused. Outside, through the high warehouse windows, the Adriatic light fell in long, pale rectangles across the stone floor. A gull turned once above the glass. "You killed Brenner," Poirot said. Not an accusation, a statement placed between them with the care of something breakable. Adler did not look at him. Brenner facilitated 12 passages in 1963 alone. He knew what happened to the ones who did not arrive. He was paid very well to continue knowing. "I understand," Poirot said. "I do not condone, but I understand." It was the most he could honestly offer, and they both knew it. The police took Adler at 3 o'clock, quietly and without incident, in the reading room where the morning had begun. He went without resistance, which surprised no one who had observed him across the preceding week, and with a composure that came not from indifference, but from the particular relief of a man who has finished something very long and very heavy, and has at last set it down. Rennes's hotel room yielded the ledger from the lining of the larger bag, exactly as Poirot had said it would. It was a slim thing, grey cloth covers, careful handwriting, columns of names and dates and numbers. Rather ordinary in appearance for an object that had governed so much. Poirot looked at it for a moment in the hands of the receiving officer, and then looked away. He had seen enough of its kind. Chapter 10. The World. After the ledger was examined by the notary that same afternoon and formally received into evidence by the Trieste police at 4:30, it contained 112 pages. The entries ran from 1963 to 1979 in a hand that was precise and undecorated, with the quality of someone who had learned early that legibility in record-keeping was a professional virtue. Names, dates, amounts, destinations. The final column, whose heading translated from the German as status, contained in almost every entry a single word meaning delivered. In 11 entries the column was blank. In 3, It contained a word meaning lost in transit, which was a phrase so comprehensively inadequate to its actual meaning that Poirot did not trust himself to think about it for long. Victor Renz was taken to the Trieste Central Police Station at 5 o'clock, where he was met by a lawyer who had arrived with a speed that indicated advance preparation. He made no statement. He walked from the exhibition building to the waiting car with the same composed attention to personal dignity that he had displayed throughout the morning, and it was only when the car door closed that Poirot, watching from the steps of the building, registered the particular quality of that composure for what it was. Not indifference, not contempt. The composure of a man who has known for a very long time that this day would eventually come, and who has spent that time deciding how he intends to meet it. Poirot stood on the steps for a moment after the car had gone, with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat set correctly against the afternoon wind off the Adriatic, and considered whether this constituted any kind of consolation. He decided that it did not, but it was, at least, a form of honesty, which was, on the whole, preferable to the alternative. Inspector Nowak remained in Trieste for 3 days, dealing with the international dimensions of the investigation, which were considerable. The ledger established connections to police matters in 4 countries that had been separately open, separately unresolved, for periods ranging from 12 to 30 years. Nowak approached these complications with the settled equanimity of a man who has learned that the resolution of one problem generally produces several more, and that this is simply the nature of the work. He came to find Poirot on the morning of the 6th at the small café near the waterfront, where Poirot had established the habit of taking his breakfast. The eggs he had discovered on the second morning were excellent. The coffee required no adjustment whatsoever. He had, accordingly, developed a moderate affection for the establishment that he was not entirely sure the establishment had reciprocated, but that was a matter between himself and the proprietor. Nowak sat down, accepted coffee, and regarded Poirot with the expression of a man composing what he wants to say before saying it. "Horak," he said at length. "He has cooperated fully. He says that Renz instructed him to pass Elena Kovacs to someone who would deal with her. He says he did not know the precise method that would be used." "He knew enough," Poirot said. "Yes." Nowak turned his cup on its saucer. The method, incidentally, was not drowning. The pathology confirms that she died elsewhere and was subsequently placed at the dock. She was poisoned. The compound used is consistent with materials traceable to a chemical supplier in Vienna, with whom Renz has a 30-year commercial relationship. He paused. "It will be enough." Poirot nodded. He looked at the harbour where a fishing boat was making its slow way towards the open water. "And Adler," he said. "He has also cooperated. Thoroughly, I am told, to the point of providing documentation of his own movements and methods that the prosecution did not ask for and was somewhat surprised to receive." Nowak allowed himself a brief, dry expression that was not quite a smile. "His lawyer is not pleased. Adler appears to regard the lawyer as a formality rather than a resource." "He wants it on record," Poirot said quietly. "All of it. He has spent 22 years assembling the account, but he is not going to allow it to be reduced to a charge sheet." Nowak considered this. Outside, the gull that had been regarding the café table with optimistic attention since their arrival reconsidered its prospects and departed. "Brenner," Nowak said. "Vienna, the explosion." "Yes," said Poirot. "That will not be simple." "No. Another pause. He is not a sympathetic defendant. He is, however, a man who lost his father to a system whose architects are now facing prosecution. The courts will have to decide what weight that carries. He picked up his coffee. I find I do not envy them the task. Poirot found that he agreed. He called on Caterina on the evening of the 7th, at the small hotel near the old town where she had remained throughout, declining repeated suggestions from Nowak that she return to Budapest. Now she opened the door to him with the expression of someone who has been waiting but has declined to admit it, and they sat in the 2 chairs by the window with the early autumn dark settling over the streets below. He told her everything that was relevant, and a little more than that, because she had earned it. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. When he had finished, she was quiet for a time, and he did not fill the silence, which was the right thing to do. She knew who Renz was, Caterina said at last. Before she came to Gdansk, she had identified him months earlier. She came to the festival because she had learned he would be there, and she wanted to watch him. She wanted to understand him, Poirot said. That is a different thing. Caterina looked at him. Something in her face had shifted over the preceding days in a way that was not the ordinary process of grief resolving. It was the shift of someone who has been carrying a specific weight and has been told, with sufficient evidence to be believed, that the weight has been lifted, and who is discovering that the absence of a weight one has carried for a long time is itself a kind of strangeness. She spent 15 years on this, Caterina said. She did not live to see it end. No, Poirot said. That is the part that does not resolve. He said it simply, without the modifications that people generally apply to such statements in the hope of making them easier to receive. Caterina looked at him for a moment, and then nodded once, with the precision of someone acknowledging a correct answer to a question she had not been sure anyone would answer honestly. Thank you, she said. He left her at 9 o'clock and walked back to his hotel through streets that smelled of salt and the first suggestion of autumn wood smoke from somewhere above the old town. He walked without particular speed, his cane tapping the cobblestones at its customary interval, his hat at its customary angle. A couple passed him arm in arm, speaking rapidly in Italian, absorbed in whatever matter of mutual consequence had their complete attention. A cat regarded him from a doorstep with a judicial composure of its kind, and found him, apparently, acceptable. Thomas Novak came to the hotel on the morning of the 8th, which was the morning of Poirot's departure. He was waiting in the lobby, large and quiet in his coat, and he stood when Poirot came down the stairs with his case. They shook hands. Neither man sat down. My son tells me you managed the whole thing from Gdansk, Thomas said, that the announcement was constructed to move Renz before the auction rather than after, that you had already obtained the warrant the previous evening. The announcement was necessary to produce the movement, Poirot said. A man who believes he has been identified will secure his most important possession. A man who believes he has time will not. Yannick says you ended the road. Poirot considered this for a moment. I ended the killing, he said. The road was ended long ago by the people who survived it. What I ended was the account. Thomas Novak looked at him steadily, his dark eyes, so like his son's, then held in them something that had not been there on the waterfront 3 days earlier. Not peace, precisely, which would have been too simple, but the particular quality of a man who has come to the last page of a very long document and found the final entry correctly made. That will have to be enough, Thomas said. "It will have to be," Poirot agreed. They parted at the hotel door. Poirot's car was waiting. The morning was cool and clear, the Adriatic visible at the end of the long, straight street in its pewter and silver, entirely indifferent to the events of the preceding week, as large bodies of water generally are. He settled himself in the car, placed his bag on the seat beside him, and checked the time. The train from Trieste to Paris departed at 11:40, which gave him precisely the interval he required to reach the station without haste, and to drink one additional coffee of the quality the morning had established as available in this city. He thought, briefly and without the intention of revisiting it at length, about Adler, about the 22 years of accumulated purpose that had brought a man of considerable intelligence and genuine scholarly achievement to a reading room in Trieste to deliver a confession no one had asked for. About the particular species of justice that resembles, from a certain angle, its opposite. About the ledger in its grey cloth covers with its columns of names and its blank final entries, which would now pass through courts and archives and perhaps, eventually, into the kind of permanent record that amber makes of the things it touches. Whether that was preservation or entrapment was a question he was prepared to leave open. The car moved through the morning city. The amber festival banners had been taken down from the last of the caravan vehicles, he noticed, as they passed the exhibition warehouse. The building stood plain and grey in the early light, its functions suspended, its cases emptied by the police inquiry, its high windows reflecting a sky of cloudless blue. He did not look at it for long. There was, he reflected, as the car turned toward the station and the sea disappeared behind the buildings, no entirely satisfactory conclusion to an investigation of this kind. There was only what had been established, what had been prevented, and what remained, which was always rather more than one would wish, and always rather less than one had feared. The eggs in Paris, or he had reason to believe, were excellent. He would take the matter of Trieste's coffee under consideration on the return journey and render his verdict in due course. The little grey cells, having discharged their present obligations, settled into the comfortable silence of the temporarily unemployed. It would not, he knew, last long. It never did.